Good evening, everyone. I am Chrissy Kelly of AbScent, and welcome to our 24th webinar series on a Tuesday evening, which we hold these every other week. So it's lovely to have you here tonight. Before we start with the program, I would just like to mark the fact that this is 1 year since the lockdown came to these shores. Of course, we are, 1 year ago, we were just getting into the pandemic. This is something that has changed everything, not least for AbScent. And so I'd like to take the opportunity and say to everyone in the AbScent family, thank you for your support. It's been lovely to have you with us for this last year. And if you are someone who has been touched by the COVID virus, I am wishing you well with your recovery in whatever form that should take. Tonight, we're talking about smell, taste, and flavor. And with me tonight, we have Associate Professor Alexander Fjaeldstad. I hope I've pronounced that right, from Aarhus University in Denmark. And he is going to be talking to us a little bit about his work on smell, taste, and flavor. Also tonight, we have with us Professor Barry Smith, who is frequently on this with us on these webinars. Barry is the director of the Center for the Study of the Senses at the Institute of Philosophy at the University of London. That's way too many syllables, Barry. We're going to have to just somehow compress that. I'm going to get them all right. So, and finally, we have Aidan tonight. Aidan is has been working with us on most of these webinars. He will be manning the chat bar and the question and answer panel. So if you have questions, and I have no doubt you will, please put them in the Q&A bar, and let's leave the chat free for any other sort of administrative details. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to you, Barry, and let's talk about smell, taste, and flavor.
Thanks, Chrissy, and good evening, Alexander and Aidan. Good to be here, and thank you all for joining. So, as Chrissy said, it's a year now since we went into lockdown, and it's pretty much a year since those of us who've been interested in smell and working on its contribution to flavor and what we call tasting realized that a lot was happening as a result of the coronavirus, and that all over the world we began to see people describing themselves as having lost the sense of smell, or quite often saying, I've lost my sense of taste. Took us a very long time. Colleagues here in the UK, Chrissy, as well as many others, Simon Gain and Claire Hopkins, who you've seen on these platforms before, I think, to persuade the government to include among the official symptoms of COVID-19 loss of taste and smell. But why loss of taste and smell? Well, many people reported that they couldn't taste anything. And that was when our interest was piqued as researchers who work on this. Because when we talk about taste or tasting our food, we're really always talking about at least three things: taste, touch, and smell. So when you're eating something, it's very easy to suppose, and that's how it feels to you as you're eating, that you're getting all the flavors of your food or of a drink from your tongue. But in fact, the tongue can contribute very little. What the tongue can give you is salt, sweet, sour, bitter, savory, or umami, the fifth taste. And yet all of the things that you are used to tasting, onions, olives, cucumber, strawberry, mango, melon, all those flavors are due to what the sense of smell is providing, because you don't have mango receptors on your tongue, or olive receptors, or onion receptors. And if you think of it from a kind of arithmetical point of view, you can't get the taste of an onion by saying it's salt plus what, it's, mango is sweet plus what. You do get all of those flavors by the contribution of smell. But a lot of people don't know that, both because they seem to taste all the flavors on their tongue, and also they think my sense of smell is about smelling things around me. It's about sniffing and inhaling odors. But of course, there are two routes by which odor molecules can reach the receptors in your nose. From the outside in, when we inhale, going straight up through the nostrils and to the olfactory epithelium here, And the other way is a kind of mouth breathing, when you have odor molecules you take into the mouth that are released, especially when you chew food, when you masticate it, and you release those odor molecules and they go up through the back of the throat to the nose to the same olfactory epithelium. So you can have the same molecules reaching those receptors either by breathing in or by odors going from the mouth to the nose and then back out. And if you think of it, when you swallow, you're pulsing odors up to the nose, and that's when you get that big flavor hit. It's also important to realize that we sometimes experience the foods that we're eating or the liquids we're drinking very differently depending on whether they're outside the head or inside. So a very smelly white cheese and époisse can smell really quite disgusting. It smells like a teenager's training shoe, I usually think. And yet when you pop it in the mouth, when the odors reach the nose from the mouth, delicious. So there's a difference between the way the very same odor molecules are processed. In fact, we know that the brain cares about the route by which the molecules reach the epithelium, and they project to slightly different cortical sites, and you get slightly different experiences. Similarly, the smell of coffee, wonderful normally, and yet freshly brewed coffee is a little disappointing when you drink it. You don't get the same hit as you get when you're smelling the odors in your immediate environment. So we know that what we call flavor, the technical term, is in fact an amalgam of taste and smell. They combine. And that although you're getting smell sensations in your nose from the mouth, the brain nevertheless plays this little trick on us. It tends to give us a location illusion. It makes us feel as though those tastes are actually coming from the tongue instead of from the nose. And this is called oral referral, the way a sensation is referred to another place. It occurs in one place, but is felt or experienced in another. So this we know, and this we've been working on. And when people started to turn up and say they had lost their smell or had lost their taste, it was important to try to discover, had they lost they'd certainly lost their ability to taste the flavors they knew. Had they lost their sense of smell alone? Had they lost their taste as well? Or had they just lost their sense of smell? And so I want to turn to Alexander, because as well as being a leading researcher on flavor, he's also a clinician. He also sees patients. And I wonder if, for you, Alexander, you could talk about how people present to you in the COVID times, their experience of taste and smell, and also if we can get down to how we can tease apart and how, as both an experimenter and a clinician, we can begin to find out whether people have lost their taste, their smell, or their taste and smell.
Well, we are actually lacking the word flavor in Danish, so we don't have a word for it. So we have to use sort of taste experience to explain that the taste experience is combined by smell and taste and the trigeminal nerve. So we're even a step further behind than what you described. But previously, before COVID, basically all patients complained about taste loss. And isolated taste loss was actually very rare. Among the first 500 patients we had, we looked it through, and it was only about 15 patients who had isolated taste loss. The rest had smell loss, or a combination of the two. But what was really striking in the COVID patients is the absence of both taste and smell. But from the ones that I've seen in the clinic, it's actually been a bit different than previously, because people were a little bit better than I was used to at saying this is taste and this is smell. And I think one of the reasons for that is that when you lose your sense of smell or taste or both due to COVID, it often happens rapidly. So you go from a quite high level and then often to no smell and no taste. And often it's also much younger people than we used to. So in our clinic, the average age before COVID was around 60, 65, and that's including some of the congenital smell loss patients who are often teenagers or younger. So basically, it was quite a big shift because the average age of the COVID patients are around 40, 42. So it's also a bit of a different sort of patient population to see, but it's there are quite a lot of differences actually, looking just at the demographics.
I think that's very important to get at, that sudden onset of loss of smell. I think that was what we were seeing in the populations who were reporting consequences of COVID. And I know that Chrissy was working with doctors in Italy who were saying that they found that many of them, working very close up to their patients, had noticed that they'd lost the sense of smell. But when that happens, one of the things I guess you want to do is you want to assess and measure their taste and smell acuity. You know, how good or how poor has somebody lost the sense of smell altogether? Is there hyposmia? Is there a reduced sense of smell? How much is their sense of taste reduced? So how do we go about accurately measuring that? Because what we both know is people are very bad at assessing their own ability to taste and smell.
Even people who say they have a normal sense of smell, I mean, some of them, they're almost or completely anosmic. Yeah, I completely agree with that. But I mean, the thing is, you need to have good tests, but you also need to have the normative values. But you also need to take in consideration the subjective rating that the patients, how they feel, because that's sort of what makes a big difference on quality of life. But in the early phases of the COVID, everything was shut down. Also, our Flavour clinic in Denmark, because we had to shut everything down that wasn't completely necessary. So basically, all outpatient clinics were completely shut down. And that was actually a part of the difficulty in the beginning, because people were saying that they've lost their sense of taste and the sense of smell, but there weren't any measurements of it. So that whole problem with, was it taste, was it smell, was it both? That actually took quite a while before that came about, that we were actually dealing with multiple strikes on the sensory organs.
I mean, I noticed quite a few people were contacting me on Twitter, or they were referred to me by others on Twitter saying, I've lost my ability to taste anything, I can't taste the smell. And I would often ask them, could you try this out? Could you put a bit of lemon juice on your tongue? Could you put some salt on your tongue? Could you put some sugar? Can you taste that? Quite a few of them would say, yes, I can taste that. And again, they were discovering, perhaps to their surprise, how much of what they thought was tasting was due to smell, that the absence of it made them feel as though they could taste very little indeed, or nothing indeed. And in fact, I wanted to ask Chrissy if I could, because you're someone who suffered from post-viral smell loss. When that happened to you, did it strike you as a loss of smell, or did you think that you couldn't taste things? I wonder what came first.
I mean, the first time around, the smell loss was profound. So there was no olfactory signal. And maybe I was aware that my true taste was picking up the slack. But as I recall, it too felt diminished. So in that first empty space, that empty sensory space, I didn't even feel that my sense of true taste was really working completely. And then that came back in time. And then, of course, what happened to me, which I think happens to many people, is that as you are just trying to adjust to only being able to experience food through the true tastes, you then start to crave salty and you start craving sweet. And then, of course, anything that is one of those two things. And of course, also sour. I mean, so I really gravitated toward anything with lemon on it. So yeah, I think that came a little bit later. But in the beginning, those were also diminished for me. as many people have said who've had COVID-19.
I mean, I think, I don't know whether you agree, Alexander, but I think as Chrissy says, at first you feel taste is diminished. If your sense of smell has gone, one reason why I think people who haven't lost the sense of taste think they can't taste anything is because they've never experienced salt, sweet, sour just by itself without the sense of smell. So they seem muted, they seem dull. It doesn't seem to provide them with, very much at all. So I'm interested in your description, Chrissy, of how you gradually pay attention to them and you start to sort of amplify them, probably through paying attention to them. Alexander.
Yeah, I really like the term the empty sensory space you use, Chrissy, because it is something where there is a void, because the senses they don't just it's 1 and 1 is not equal to 2. It's often equal 3 or 4. It enhances the other senses, and you end up having this quite a strange sensation afterwards that often differs as time passes, which is also one of the complexities in trying to figure out how to cook something that really tastes good, because it's not the same for everyone, but it's not the same over time for any given patient. So there are a lot of things going on, both on the peripheral level, but most certainly on the central level as well.
And I think one of those things that the way in which the taste and smell interact, we know there are odors like vanilla that boost the perception of sweetness. People smell vanilla, they think it smells sweet. There's no sweetness in it, but
well, at least in Europe, right? Because in Asia, Europe, it's a different.
Right. If you go to cuisines where you mix vanilla with salt or with fish, vanilla smells salty. That's right. But in both cases, those odors will boost the perception of salt or of sweet. And so I think probably you're right that the absence of the food odors, the food aromas, mean that your perception of the basic tastes is really a little bit muted. But I want to bring in another thing when you talked about how can we add to that sensory void with food, and that is touch, texture, and in particular, food texture. I mean, people quite surprised to realize that texture is part of flavor. Food acceptability, as one of your countrymen, Ollie Muritzen, always reminds me, food acceptability often comes down to matters of touch. So in a restaurant, most of the complaints are about, the steak was too tough, the eggs were too runny, the wine was too warm, the coffee was too cold. I mean, these are all aspects of touch that make a difference to whether we like a food. And I think as sensory scientists, you and me, Alexander, we'll do these funny things, usually with the help of people like Moritz, and we'll take a food and change its texture. You can take a cucumber and then you can make a jelly of it. When you give it to people as a jelly, they say, oh, what is that? Oh, I know. Whereas if you gave them a piece to crunch on, it's cucumber immediately. Even recognizing food is hard when the texture changes. So I think texture is another of those components which, when you've lost your sense of smell and maybe your tastes are muted, there'll be an awful lot riding on whether or not you like food due to its texture.
But it's I like the example with the restaurant, because it is something where it's something we're quite certain about. So if something is too hot or too cold, we're quite certain about it. But if you serve a wine that has a fault, people are unsure if they want to say it or not, because they don't know if their sense of smell is good enough to actually see if there is if it's detected, or if it's something that they just completely misinterpreted. So we're much more certain about the trigeminal aspects of flavor perception than we are about smell in general. And I think that's sort of an interesting aspect of how the senses are combined into this multisensory perception.
Yeah, and I think that's great, because I have a colleague, Ophelia Darwa, who's written about touch and how, it's not seeing is believing, touching is believing. You know, if you're not sure if something's real, you want to touch it, you want to have your fingers on it. So similarly, we are quite sure about touch. We feel, now we're in contact with the thing itself. So you're right, we're more certain. And interesting, you mentioned wine faults, because people often say our sense of smell is poor as humans. Not true. I mean, the fault that you get in corked wine, which is due to TCA, trichloroanisole, some humans can pick out 3 parts per trillion of this incredibly potent volatile compound. Now, if you think of it, that means you could have something the size of 2 swimming pools, Olympic swimming pools, and you could put a drop, one molecule into one, and people could tell apart which one it has. So that's an incredible skill. But I do notice, I mean, and I taste sometimes sort of semi-professionally with people, because I write about wine a little bit, but I sometimes notice that I smell a wine and I think, is it corked? I'm not sure. Usually if that's true, I give it to Ophelia Darrois, who's got a much better nose, and she says, oh my God, it's completely corked. But I've learned the following, which is quite useful, is if I have to ask myself, is it corked? Then it is, because usually you just don't notice and you let it go by. So I think your sense of smell is operating at an unconscious level too. And again, this is why it's going to be such a profound loss when we're without it, because it's doing a kind of regulatory thing. It's sort of monitoring your environment, even if it's not coming to mind and you're not terribly aware of it. It's telling you if everything's okay. It's telling you if your surroundings are familiar and normal. There's a large part, I think, of its contribution to everyday experience. And I think Chrissy knows, and many people on this webinar will know, it's only when it's gone that you notice how incredibly constant and important it was as a contribution to perception of your environment.
That's actually quite easily explained when looking at how it's connected to the rest of the brain, because it takes direct shortcut right into the parts of the brain that has to do with both liking, but also fear and disgust. So that constant monitoring in the background is running like a program on the CPU, and you don't think it's like using any of the processing power on your computer, but actually it's using quite a lot. So it's always running. And I think an example that can explain is when you take your car and drive to work. Sometimes when you get to work and you go up the stairs, you can't even remember that you took your car. And when you go back, you don't, oh, where did I park it? Because everything is just going by expectations. You do the same, you meet all the expectations, and the brain doesn't even have to work to do it. But what happens if someone suddenly crosses the road in front of you, then you switch, and the brain is really efficient at switching. So we do this sort of expectation scanning, and when there is an error in the prediction that our brain makes what is going to happen next, we get an alert. And especially from the sense of smell that really goes directly into those centers of fear and disgust. When there's alert in the mouth and you're about to swallow something, that can be extremely unpleasant.
Yeah, so you're right. You've got those very fast routes projecting to amygdala and insula and so on. But I like the fact you bring up expectations, because you're clearly a fan, I am too, of the predictive brain and predictive processing, the Bayesian brain, that our brains are trying to figure out what's going to happen next, so we're not surprised, so we can cope with things. And one thing that happens is if the signals come in from your senses and everything's okay, they can be ignored. You can just let them be. If they seem to clash with what you're expecting, you get an error message, and it's like, wait, things are going wrong. I have to revise, update quickly. And I wonder whether part of the persistent distress and the discomfort that so many people have powerfully and very articulately represented about their loss of smell when eating food, say, is the fact that they're just constantly getting that error message. They're expecting food to taste a certain way. They're expecting certain flavors. And again, they're kind of blunted by not getting what they wanted. And that's a jolt to the system. And it doesn't seem to calm down. You'd think that the brain would update, but probably because the sense of smell is so important in such a primitive system, it just doesn't go into the mix and say, okay, it's not going to be like that. So I'm wondering if, people are continually getting that error message, and that's actually quite distressing.
I absolutely think that is the case, Barry. I think that for anyone who, especially all the people in the audience who are without a sense of smell, they will know that there's the panic button is being hit over and over and over again all day, 24/7. And it is amazing how much time it takes for your brain to adjust. So and that is a horrible thing, because it does nothing but your attention is entirely focused on this these error messages.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, that's so interesting to hear, because it's something that we both might expect and we might be puzzled by. But Alexandra, I'm wondering whether, as people are suffering loss of smell through COVID, and maybe there's the gradual regeneration of olfactory receptors and things are coming back, whether there might be a lot of unconscious processing going on, so that if people were attempting to eat anything and they had not an awareness of the flavor, that they feel there's nothing there, whether they might still feel uneasy about the food because there might be some signals coming. I mean, that there's still a little bit of processing that might be doing a little assessing, to protect them or to guard against what's going in there.
I think a lot of people are experiencing either fluctuations in their sense of smell when it hopefully will return, but on the way there, that's a long way. But also the other senses. So everything is just being pushed a bit out of balance. And when you taste something and experiencing it, if there's something missing, then figuring out what is left is a quite difficult task, both for the brain and for the senses.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm aware that there are questions, and I hope that we'll come to them soon. But just before we do, I wanted to bring in yet another, and you mentioned it already, another part of the flavor system, because it's both often appealed to compensate for the loss of smell when cooking, but it's got a sort of checkered history in the COVID crisis as well, and that's the trigeminal nerve. So this is the fifth cranial nerve that serves the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And when you have too much wasabi, you feel it here, ow, and can make peppermint taste cool in the mouth, make mustard taste hot in the mouth. So some people have thought, not surprisingly, oh, why don't we add more spices, which will irritate those little trigeminal nerve endings and make the food more enjoyable, give it more sensation to the person eating. But the trigeminal nerve has also been, hasn't it, selectively hit by the coronavirus in some people? I wondered if you would say something about that.
Well, in the wake of the whole taste and smell loss debate, there was a big startup of a consortium for the global consortium for chemosensory research, and in that, a lot of different questionnaires, answers for their questionnaires were assembled from all over the world, and when sort of averaged out, the sense of smell was hit really strongly. The sense of taste a little bit less. And then the trigeminal nerve was about a little bit less than half of taste and smell. So still, I mean, and that's another issue, that it's not just you don't have smell loss, you don't have smell and taste loss, but a lot of people also experiences slight change. And just having a slight change when the other senses are gone can actually be a very big problem. So the question is, how does that sort of normalize over time? And when it subjectively normalizes, is that actually something where it's back to the same sensory level as it was before, or is it just a little bit off compared to what it used to be, which can be important when trying to cook a meal that's both pleasurable to eat for someone with intact senses and someone with post-COVID sensory loss.
Alexander, I'd be interested to know what you've observed. I certainly, obviously, in the AbScent, on the AbScent platforms, we talk a lot about, it's mostly we talk about smell loss, some taste loss. The loss of the trigeminal sense did come up quite a bit last spring, but I noticed that that's really leveled out now. And the first thing I notice is that loss of chemesthesis did not seem to be something that lasted a long time. That seemed to recover. And second of all, what I notice now is that nobody seems to mention it anymore. So I wonder whether you've noticed that maybe it's that also has dropped off in terms of what you see. You know, maybe a different variant is not attacking the trigeminal nerve. Do you have any observations on that?
The new patients coming in still have about a third of them say that there's something off. Normally it's not completely changed, but it's just very different. And that comes back to the first point that Barry mentioned, that it's actually difficult to disentangle what the sensory input to a flavor perception actually is. But they say, okay, well, pepper is not, it's much stronger than it used to be. And that's still the case for some of the new patients coming in the later waves of the COVID pandemic. But we've in the follow-up questionnaires that we made for our patients, it is at least described as not as big as a problem as it was initially later on. But it's something that is quite difficult to measure because, as Barry mentioned, it's actually quite a complex sensory system, because it's heat, it's pressure, it's touch, it's vibration, it's a lot of different things. So having just one test to quantify it is not nearly enough.
Right.
And isn't that the problem? Sorry, just before we do questions, isn't that the problem too for you as a clinician, that when people lose the sense of smell, or the sense of smell is decreased, they might still get from some odors that sort of tingling sensation in their nasal linings from the trigeminal irritation of the odors, and they might think, oh, I'm still smelling something.
That might definitely be a part of the explanation why people are quite bad often at ranging their own level before testing, and then after a sensory battery of half an hour sitting there testing, they become quite a lot better because they've sort of tried to align, okay, how did I do? How did I perform? Was I certain about it? So actually you sort of get balanced in how do you do compared to other people. But it is definitely something that makes it difficult for someone saying, I'm completely anosmic, but I can still smell some things. And that's, I mean, that anosmia is not just anosmia. You can be specifically anosmic to different things. So if you've some people cannot recognize the soap part of cilantro because they don't have that one receptor that adds to that sort of flavor image. But you can also have some odors that are barely detectable in one person compared to the other. And then for other odors, it's completely the opposite way. So being the super smeller is not something that you necessarily are on all odor components. I would find that quite rare.
So can I just interrupt you for a moment? I think we'll go to Aidan. I see we've got lots of questions. So Aidan, let's take a couple of questions and see what the listeners would like to know.
Sure. Well, while we were just speaking about the trigeminal nerve, I think this is quite an appropriate one to start with. Is everything our noses, does everything our noses do class everything as smell? For example, is the reaction to ammonia in smelling salts an acute odor-based reaction, or another type of chemical reaction. So we're looking at, is it a different part of the brain for trigemination in that sense? Chemesthesis, sorry.
Alexander, would you like to answer?
Yeah, that's so it's a pain sensation, and traditionally it is perceived by the trigeminal nerve, and that goes a completely different way into the brain. It has different brain regions that are activated, and it's not merged until it reaches the very frontal part of the brain, where sort of all the flavor components are combined. But with that said, there's been studies that have found that there are actually, in the nerve endings, there are connections between olfactory nerve endings and trigeminal nerve endings. So perhaps there's actually also something going on the peripheral level, because the sense of smell is very dependent on sort of the interior climate of the nose. So if you in a winter day go from a heated room outside in the cold, the nose needs to adapt very quickly in order to be able to continuously smell and breathe. And the two senses are sort of merged in perhaps more ways than we have initially thought.
And one of the things to say, and it might be because of that tight connection, there are patterns of trigeminal irritation that particular odors give us. And when people lose the sense of smell, they might be able to get a kind of image of what the missing smell is from that pattern of trigeminal irritation. So again, this is why people, Alexander's had it, I've had it, people will say to me, I've lost my sense of smell, but I can still smell the fish market. You think, no, you can't, but you're getting that trigeminal hit of the fish odors. So yeah.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Right, Aidan, another question.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, it's just there's a plane going past. I live basically on an airfield, so it's quite noisy. Sorry. If the bad smells that are such a common symptom of the disorders that affect us are sulfur-based, and sulfur plays a key role in the smells our noses and brains detect, is sulfur being treated a topic of special interest in studies? Similarly, for taste, if lemon is a common taste regained or gained upon recovery, are the chemical components of lemon of special interest?
I think that there was actually some very interesting points about that by Jane Parker on a previous webinar, who identified the sort of the components that really trigger parosmia. And sulfur components are generally perceived as often negative, but it's not the whole picture, because some in people with a normal sense of smell, they actually perceive some sulfur components pleasant. And another thing is that smells are really complex combinations of molecules. So you can have, that's the case in perfume, that you can have a very, very nice combination of pleasant smelling molecules, but it's not until you add that musk or that sort of just a hint of something slightly unpleasant that you get an exceptional perfume. So you can actually, if you smell that on its own, it's animal, fecal, it's very unpleasant, but when you add it in the right concentration, it really gives that depth and complexity. And that's one of the problems, I guess, with when losing a part of the smell image, that everything gets distorted. So that very fine balance in what makes something pleasurable can actually be quite off.
Yeah, and the sulfur compounds are certainly interesting in Jane Parker's work, because they appear in Maillard reaction, in roasted meats, they appear in coffee, they appear in lots of, you get them in onions, you get them in eggs. So they appear in lots of the foods that people are finding particularly problematic in parosmia. Lemons are also interesting because the citrus note is a very light molecule and very fast acting. So there's an interest in whether lighter or heavier molecules, which of course perfumers use, as Alexander said, to achieve certain effects. The things that strike you immediately, the things that arrive slowly, the things that persist. So it's well worth looking at how people with smell dysfunctions are responding to these different kinds of molecule groups. Yeah.
But, oh, sorry, just in terms of the chemical components of lemon's special interest, I think we spoke about in several webinars before, because we use lemon as an essential oil to smell. In Thomas Hummel's research, they found that these are just being selected just for the study, and that's why we use those, because the most research has been done. That's right, Chris, isn't it?
Yeah.
But if you look at Thomas Hummel's basic set in the smell training kit, you've got lemon, so you've got these very light molecules. You've got rose, PEA, which is a non-trigeminal stimulant. It's one of the few odors that has no trigeminal irritation to it at all. And then you've got clove and eucalyptus, which are both very powerful trigeminal irritants. And the eucalyptus, of course, has got that menthol hit to it as well, that high note. So it's a very, as you'd expect from Thomas, it's a very well worked out group to kind of look at various dimensions of our smell abilities.
And we've got another question here from Deka, actually. This one's for Alexander. Alexander said that we need to take subjective ratings of smell and taste into account. We ask people if they've lost the sense of smell, but do we know they have? The sudden onset is dramatic with COVID, but doesn't mean the sense of smell is completely gone. How many people have diminished versus lost sense of smell with COVID?
Oh, good questions. I think my point with the subjective assessment is important. Is not something where you should rely only on that. You should also measure it, because otherwise it's quite difficult to see the improvement over time. And there are problems with subjective measurements, as we talked about before, with trigeminal nerves giving the perception of actually having odor sensations as part of the olfactory perception system, but it actually stems from trigeminal activation. So we of course always do testing with a complete battery to get a better picture of what are the olfactory capabilities. But a part of that is also, I think it's interesting to mention here, now that we talked a little bit about parosmia, is that there's actually now a parosmia smell test that's been published, which is quite interesting to look at the hedonic aspect of how we perceive smells, because the tests that we have, they don't cover all aspects of what it is to smell. It's a very complex way of perceiving our surroundings. So it's not just threshold discrimination and identification, but those three measurements give a quite good picture of the general level. But in parosmia, how it's perceived is actually now also measurable. And I think that will come more into the clinics because that is something that's really important to the patients. They don't really care if they have a pretty good score if everything they perceive smells horrible.
Alexander, what is this parosmia, this test like?
Well, it's a rating of the identification test. So it was recently published, I think, half a year ago or something like that. So we're trying to adapt it into sort of our clinical pipeline for the patients where it's relevant.
It also it's worth saying that some published work recently by Claire Hopkins with colleagues in Italy have shown that when you're giving people an smell identification test with the AbScent test, where they've got the scratch and sniff cards, people are asked to smell something and then choose which of 4 potential descriptors are the right ones for the smell. People recovering from smell loss often say, I can't smell anything, but 50% of them are guessing correctly quite a lot of these compounds. So again, that's interesting. There's this mismatch between the subjective rating and what they can objectively do. And I think in the normal case, we forget. I mean, most people I talk to and I say, we're going to test your sense of smell. They say, I've got a terrible sense of smell. And then you give them the sniffing stick test, threshold, discrimination, identity, and they've got a very high score. So smell is particularly interesting in that respect. It's very unlike your other senses. With your other senses, your eyesight, your hearing, your confidence ratings in your own judgments usually reliably track your acuity, and smell's not like that. So it's a sort of standout. It appears rather differently. And we might be kind of interested further down the line in finding out why that is. It's closer to people's interoceptive ratings. When you ask people to rate their interoception, that's their ability to notice changes in their bodily awareness, their heart rate changing, their skin conductance changing, and so on. Some people can guess at it and say, I'm just guessing what my heart rate is, but they're absolutely accurate, and they have very good interoceptive accuracy, but they don't have good interoceptive awareness. So I think there's a mismatch in smell too between accuracy and awareness in normal people, which makes this all very difficult when we start to look at what happens when things go wrong.
But so that also seems,
Sorry. It's certainly that people who take AbScent tests, people who have parosmia that take an AbScent test or a sniff and sticks test, when they are presented with things to identify, of course they quickly recognize the smell of new coffee, because their perception of coffee has changed. And now they've come to recognize what the smell of coffee is like, and that's why they pass that question on the test. So
yes, this is the test. The case that Claire was publishing on was where people hadn't yet reached a parosmic stage, but were anosmic, reportedly anosmic, and yet thinking they were guessing, they were getting a lot of these odors right.
And that's a quite important point, and that's a good argument for testing as well, because the prognosis of someone who has absolutely no sense of smell is worse than when you can actually maybe subconsciously recognize that there is something going on that leads you in a certain direction, because then you have active olfactory receptors, and those receptors are susceptible for olfactory training. So you can actually stimulate with odors, where it's quite important to use high concentration odors, so you get as much stimulation as possible.
Right. Aidan, could we have that question that I asked you about? Kate, can we have Kate's question?
Sure, this is the one that you're saying. I've noticed a lot of posts on forums from people saying that they have smell but no flavor, or flavor but no smell. Is it possible to have one without the other, given how they're linked? And I do mean flavor here, not just the basic taste. I feel my smell is starting to improve after 4 months, but I'm not noticing any progress with flavor. So I'd really be interested to know how they can work independently. We've had quite a lot of these questions in previous webinars. So it'd be quite interesting to what you guys do.
We have, and can I just add in that I see two different things, happening. One is where people say, yes, I can smell something when I sniff it, but I have no experience of flavor. And other people will say, I have full experience of flavor, but I have no sense of smell. So let's try and unpick that. What might be going on there?
So the second one, there is some published evidence about this. I mean, we've known there are cases where people have got retronasal olfaction, that's the sense of smell due to odors going from the mouth to the nose, but they're orthonasal, their outer smell is not working. It's often due to blockage, it's nasal polyps or whatever, so they can still get something in the mouth, they can't get it from the nose. But there are also some cases that are not nasal polyps that have shown up in the literature that make this very puzzling. I haven't seen, but maybe Alexander has the other way around, where people have got, they can smell things perfectly okay, but they're not getting flavor from them. Have you come across that?
Yeah, I have, and it's important to distinguish, because you can people will, especially if there might be some abnormalities of the nose or asymmetries, people will say, I want to try and improve my nasal airflow, I want to try and do these things, but you actually have something that doesn't make sense in sort of retronasal olfactory function and orthonasal. So sometimes it's important to test both. And I've had patients who've had normal orthonasal function but no retronasal function, and also the other way around. And it's not always been possible to actually figure out why is this happening. A possible explanation could be that there had been a partial disruption of the neuroepithelium, so the olfactory epithelium in the top of the nose. In younger people, it lines about half of the nose, the upper half of the nose. But with aging, the neuroepithelium sort of becomes smaller and smaller, and the surface is taken over by the respiratory epithelium. So the ones that give heat, give humidity to the air when we breathe. And perhaps sometimes a viral infection can hit locally and destroy a part where you have a lot of flow coming up retronasally when you smell. But it's just a theory, but it is puzzling. And it's a quite rare thing, at least from the patients I've seen in the clinic. So it's not something that's been done a lot of studies on that I'm aware of.
It's interesting. I mean, I throw something a bit random in here, but philosophers who care a lot about trying to individuate the senses, they've argued about whether we've really got one sense of smell or two. And usually the way we talk about it is it's one sense of smell, but there are two pathways to smell. But these are very interesting cases which make you wonder whether you could have two independent senses of smell, one working, one not. Double dissociations of the sort you're describing makes that really possibility. Strange.
This is something that I was just thinking, but there generally, because I work in Flavour, and there's generally a difference in thresholds between retro and orthonasal olfaction. So from my side, I would think that if you have a lowered sense of smell orthonasally, which is the most powerful, really, it's going to be a bigger difference retronasally, because you're not going to get, you know, the power of olfaction in that sense. That's what I would presume, but we've seen it in two different ways, so it's really hard to.
It's not the case in all compounds that retronasal and orthonasal have different intensity. So beautiful paper by Dana Small and Thomas Hummel, 2005, where they tested the perceptions of the quality and intensity of odors coming orthonasally or retronasally with tubes inside the mouth. And it turns out that, yes, you have mismatches, but chocolate has got exactly the same intensity and quality, whether orthonasally or retronasally presented, which is why I think it's one of the wonder foods. You smell it and you get what you expect, and you're very happy. Apart from the sugar and the fat, another good reason for loving chocolate.
Yeah, I don't really like chocolate, but
boo.
Right. Okay. Do we need another question? Because believe it or not, we're rapidly getting to the end of the hour. So let's see if we can't answer some of these questions quickly. We kind of, Sally Ann Dean asked a question again on the same subject. So I think we sort of answered that one.
Could I ask quickly while you're finding one, Alexander, a question? I've come across people, I think on the Facebook group, maybe Chrissy has too, people who say they sometimes feel as though they're struggling to take in air. And I wondered whether, just a hypothesis, if your trigeminal nerve endings are not responding, whether the trigeminal system tells you you're getting airflow into the nose and it's actually giving you a sense, because a lot of the people who describe this experience of not being able to, they feel they're not taking in air. If you give them a pulse oximeter and you look at their blood oxygen levels, they're absolutely fine.
Yep.
But it could be a terrifying thing if one of our regulatory systems is just letting you know that you're breathing in because you can feel the air coming in. And if that feeling's gone, it might make you feel as though you're drowning or you're not breathing properly. Have you come across that?
It is quite a common problem in rhinology, that you can have changes in the perception and it goes the other way around. So you can have empty nose syndrome, where you just feel like everything is just running straight through, and you can have a feeling of nasal congestion, but everything is fine, and it looks perfectly normal. So definitely it has a trigeminal component, because that's how we sense what is going on. We sense airflow, we sense cooling, we sense humidity, and it's just a very fine balance. So I've come to really appreciate the nose as the most important organ, because there's so much. We have a complete air conditioner sitting at the very forefront of our heads that can heat up and can humidify air at such a pace that it's incredible. You can run a marathon in Antarctica, and your lungs won't dry out and freeze out of the cold and dry air. So it's a really great capacity, and there's a large sort of reserve. But sometimes when the balance goes off, it really affects breathing. But of course, that also affects smelling, because you get crusts in the nose, or you get a runny nose, you get swelling in the nose, and you alter the airflow in the nose. And having the sense of smell at the very top of this sort of very narrow nose, that is something that can definitely affect it.
What a great description of the nose and its importance and power. That's really terrific.
I personally wouldn't try running in Antarctica, but I'll take your word for it on we've got an interesting question here. After a period of time with parosmia, is there any indication of the length of time taken to recover is impacted by smell memory? As in, because people have had the disgust reaction to certain foods, they find it difficult to get past that in order to recognize the actual flavor. So what do you guys think on that side? Remembering what it used to smell like, is that
I think remembering what what food used to taste like is very important for parosmics, to kind of try and focus on that, and especially when they get to the stage where it's not so horrible that they can't push through. So we do recommend trying to push through, but for people who have really severe parosmia, that's just not an option. And they might be sick if they did that. But once it's possible to push through, then I think memories of what food used to taste like are really important, and that you want to engage with those as you sit down for a meal. And so often, the first couple of mouthfuls are terrible. And then once you kind of get into the meal, somehow then that starts to level out a bit, and it's just a little bit more palatable.
I like that too, Chrissy, because you often tell people in doing smell training to sort of think about the odor they're trying to go for. And we know there are lots of top-down connections from the brain back down to the olfactory bulb and to the peripheral level too. So, being able to conjure up the right odor image is probably quite powerful in trying to reconnect the regenerating receptors with what the brain already has.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an interesting question here about body odor. This is slightly off topic because we're not tasting that, but
some people are. But
it's one that is a source of great consternation for people. I know a lot of people do worry about that, or they find it very bothersome that the perception of their own body odors and the body odor of other people is really very distorted. That is something that is part of the parosmia experience. So the person is asked whether is it real or is that a perception problem? And I think the answer is that it's a perception problem, and that that will start to normalize with recovery.
But I think it's important to mention when talking about the body odors that smell for many people is still a taboo. So it's not something where you would go over to someone and say, can you smell my armpit? But I find it I find patients having a lot of comfort when they have a spouse or close friends that they're comfortable asking these questions to, because that gives them the certainty that they can walk around without having this sort of feeling that, oh, do I smell? Do I not smell? Is that it really gives them relief to have a handful of people at work and at home that they can use their noses.
Yeah, that's like two types of smell test really in that sense, isn't it? So yeah,
Yep.
we could all do with that, I guess. Interesting.
Well,
Yeah.
believe it or not, we have reached the top of the hour, so I don't know where that hour went.
Mhm.
But it was lovely having you all with us. And so I'd like to say thank you to our guests, Alexander and Barry, and of course, Aidan. In 2 weeks at this time, I will have with me Professor Eunice Olofsson and Professor Maria Larsson from the University of Stockholm. And we are going to be talking about smell loss and smell memory. So I think that will be a really interesting event. We really enjoyed having Eunice last time. He was talking about what happens to the brain when we smell train. So I think we'll be sort of building on that a little bit. I look forward to seeing you then. And thank you very much for being with us tonight. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.